Another interesting thing about Noah and his creativity is the topic he studies is not a topic that people typically study in business schools. Noah is at INSEAD, which is often rated as the top business school in Europe. So it's also quite interesting to see how he has been creative in taking a topic and an area of research that's normally outside main areas that we look at, and been able to bring it into other areas to help us gain new insights. I'm really looking forward to hearing Noah's talk. I got to know him through Michael, my student, and on top of doing work on creativity, Noah himself is a very creative person. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation. Noah, with all of that being said, thank you so much for sharing your work with us and spending some of your time with us here at NICO. Terribly exciting. And I myself have been looking forward to this for quite some time and thinking about all the fun that we did have at NICO when you used to come visit us from the University of Chicago. So thank you so much. And I'm turning the stage over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it. I will share my screen now. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can all see slides, hear me, etc. Thank you, Brian. That was a very kind introduction. Leaves me a little suspicious, actually. And you know, Brian's a little bit required to say that because he's a co-author with Michael and myself and Sharon Kopman, who's at UC Irvine on a paper that we're about to send back into ASQ. So that's exciting. So the presentation today is called Two Pathways to Creativity, How Collaboration Leads to Novelty in Popular Music. And as Brian alluded, this is part of a much broader stream of research that I'm conducting primarily with Michael, but with a number of other co-authors as well on different projects. And Michael's doing some of the same with some other co-authors as well. And this project is also with Eric Contain, who's at ESMT in Berlin and is also here this evening. Thanks for coming, Eric. And Yuri Moll, who's at the University of Melbourne, and it's like 3 a.m. there, so I don't think he's joining us, but with Yuri, you never know. And so this is relatively early stage work. We've been working on this project, and I say this project because this paper is one half of something that was originally a single project and then got split into two. For a long time, although only recently did we decide to split it up and focus on two different aspects of it. And so this is something that I would really love to get feedback and questions on. There's actually a couple places where I've posed questions in the slides because I think that this could be a really interesting audience to provide some insight and some fresh perspectives into what we're trying to do. And so I'm going to launch in, and knowing me, I'll probably run too long, but I'll try to stop myself so that there's plenty of time for questions and input. And please feel free to use the Q&A. So when we think about creativity, we typically think about it from a social perspective, right? There's certainly this myth or the folklore around the lone genius. There's Bob Dylan, of course, and we just assume that there's creative genius and an individual ability and some endowment that people have or they don't, or they can develop. And in general, that's largely been debunked because even the most creative geniuses are putting together work with collaborators. And so that's mostly where we're going to spend our time today. But that's one explanation for creativity. Another explanation for where creative influence comes from, right? How individuals are spurred on to be more creative is the institutional forces. What are the conditions that you're working in that allow you to enable or constrain you to be more or less creative? I put up the example of Motown, which was a label, but also really a sound that on one hand prompted some creativity, plenty of creativity, but also was actually fairly constraining because there were very specific boundaries within which Berry Gordy, who was the founder and primary producer, wanted his artists to sound like. And so that enabled some creativity, but only within certain boundaries. And then lastly, and where we're going to focus today, is teamwork and collaboration. And this is generally what we view as the crux or the main source of creative inspiration. The people that you work with, the people that you come into contact with, and how much they're able to share their ideas, their knowledge, et cetera, with a focal actor or an artist. And that's what spurs on greater creativity. Picture here is of the band, one of my favorite bands from the 60s. And they were 4 Canadians and a guy from Alabama who basically started to sing music from the American South. and put out several albums that were among the most creative in one of the most creative eras of music. And so how did they come together and spur each other on to be more creative? So this is where we're going to spend our time focusing on collaboration. And when we think about more specifically, when we double click on collaboration, we basically have, from the sociological tradition or the network school, basically suggests that it's the structure of your collaboration network, right? So the sociogram on the left there is pulled from something else. But if you want to think that the blue people are artists in one genre and the orange are in a different genre, the artists in that network that are connected to people from different colors are going to be more likely to be creative. That tends to be the assumption around the way that people that study networks think about creative inspiration, right? Connecting with diverse others and diverse ideas provides more recombinatory material. That's a lot of Brian's work is in that area, right? How do you take these different ideas, these different pieces of knowledge, put them together and put out something more creative, whether that's science, music, art, Broadway shows, what have you. And sort of a canonical example from music comes from the 1980s, which many of you hopefully are old enough to remember this, or at least you've seen or heard of it, when Run DMC, the hip hop group trio, came together with Aerosmith, the classic rock outfit, and put together a song that basically melded rock and hip hop, Walk This Way, which is an Aerosmith song. And you can see from this book cover that it was actually not only quite successful, it, according to this particular author, changed American music forever, right? That recombination, because there was a connection of diverse others, created something new and different that changed the trajectory of music. Okay, so that's kind of a canonical example and the way that we think about it sociologically. However, work in social psychology and kind of our intuition and probably lived experience suggests that it's maybe not just the structure that influences creativity, right? There might be something else. And I offer you 3 examples, of which there are probably many, many more. I don't know that anyone would suggest that it was Paul and John's connection to diverse others and diverse ideas necessarily that spurred them on to be as creative, right? It might have been competition, it might have been inspiration, it might have been some kind of norm, but whatever it was something in between them that I think went beyond just the structure of their connections, right? The same, I alluded to Berry Gordy before, that's him on the bottom left with the Supremes. Mary Wilson just passed away yesterday or 2 days ago. And right, again, his influence was around having a particular sound. It wasn't necessarily that he was pulling from lots of diverse things. He had a specific set of ideas and he wanted them implemented in a certain way. And that inspiration spurred on lots of hits and lots of creativity. And then lastly, you have Jay-Z and Beyonce, right? And to some extent, they're coming from slightly different genres, but at the same time, it surely has something, their creative collaborations and connection probably has something to do with more than just the diverse ideas and diverse knowledge that they bring to the collaborations when they work together. And so, working with other creative people surely has an influence of its own beyond the diverse ideas that they provide access to. And that's what we're interested in, which brings us to the research questions. Can we empirically demonstrate that access to diverse ideas enhances creativity? That's our baseline model, right? This is something that's generally been demonstrated. There are often proxies for it, and so we're trying to get closer to demonstrating it directly, but that's a baseline finding. And then to ask, is exposure to creative alters a second path through which creative influence can flow beyond that recombination of diverse ideas? And then if so, how do these 2 potential sources of creative inspiration work or not work together? And so that's what we're trying to do in this particular project. So the empirical setting, it was alluded to earlier, coming from the music industry. And, Brian was generous enough to help Michael and myself when we were both grad students with some funding to help collect this data from a company called the Echo Nest, which is a music information retrieval company. And basically it was founded by 2 MIT PhDs at the intersection of musicology and machine learning. And the idea was basically to be able to take songs and extract the features from them, to be able to understand through algorithms what the music sounds like. And they were so good at what they did that they got bought by Spotify, and they now run a lot of Spotify's recommendation engines. And through a series of sort of bizarre happenstances, Michael and I met at a Booth Kellogg PhD meeting when I think Michael was a first or second year. I was a third or fourth year. We stumbled across this data set and just started collecting it, which is a longer story for another time, but we got very lucky and then had a little bit of a nice funding source, courtesy of Brian, that allowed us to collect quite a bit of data. And we augmented that with a site called Music Brains, which is an online music encyclopedia that is basically open source, community fed with lots and lots of information, but it's also curated so that the data quality is quite good. So this is where our data comes from and where we're building this. And to give you sort of a broader setting about the music industry, the global music industry, about 45 billion plus in total revenue worldwide. Of course, that's pre-COVID. That's been hit really, really hard. There's now 150 million plus paying Spotify subscribers. And our data, we actually go up to about 2013. The reason we stop in 2000 is a little bit of sort of a historical artifact, path dependence. And it's something we actually may augment. We may add on to, because our data do go up another 13, 14 years. But for the project right now, we go from 1955 up to 2000. And the data is pretty exhaustive, right? You have to think about, what does Spotify have access to? And that's the bulk of our data, is the bulk of Spotify's data during that time period. It does go back earlier, but things start to get pretty spotty then. And it skews Western for sure, right? If you've ever been on Spotify and looked for maybe some more obscure stuff, it's possible they didn't have it. However, it's pretty global coverage. And like Brian was saying earlier, we think it's pretty unique in terms of the size and the scope of the data that we have. And we're fortunate to have that song level data, which I'll talk about in just a second, coming from the Echo Nest. We've got artist level data coming from Music Brains and Spotify. And overall, as Brian said, 20 million songs. We've got about 2 million artists. And for this, the subset that we have is over 600,000 songs from about 25,000 artists and groups. And so that's what we're working with here. And the question again is, how are we going to determine creative inspiration? And so that we want to start by focusing on a dependent variable and how is it that we measure creativity? And so if you think about, what does the creative process create? It creates some sort of output. And the way that we're going to measure that, given the data that we have, and we have some justification for this, which I won't necessarily get into here, but we're looking at product novelty, right? How novel is a particular song that's come out? And if you're thinking, well, a couple of people could just like bang on a bunch of different instruments and that's going to maybe show up as super novel, that's potentially true. But one of the reasons why our data stop in the year 2000 is because January 2001, conveniently, is when iTunes came out and self-publishing music became a lot easier. So in our window of data, 1955 to 2000, everything that's in our data set had to be released by a record label. Now, there's some record labels that are willing to put out much more bizarre stuff versus others that will just do more mainstream. However, it had to have appeal to some market. And so that allows us to say, yes, what we're looking at is within the bounds of what's acceptable. And we can look therefore within those bounds at novelty and to determine, okay, what songs are more creative. So to build this particular variable, we use the Echo Nest sonic attributes. And if you have even a passing familiarity with music, these will probably look pretty familiar, right? For every song, we have the key that it's in, whether it's major or minor, what the tempo is, and the time signature, all again based on the algorithmic data that we get from the Echo Nest. And then we have a series of what we'll say are the more sort of subjective listening experience. And so this is what the Echo Nest programmers, when they were building their algorithms, wanted to get a sense of, how can we compare songs to each other in a way that differentiates them and helps us understand them better, to be able to give better recommendations and have a better understanding for listeners. And so what they did is they created variables like acousticness, right? How likely was the song recorded just by acoustic means versus more electric? How danceable the song is. Again, these are all 0 to 1 scale. How energetic, right? How hard does it sound? Think of like hard rock as being very energetic. How live does the recording sound? How much speech goes into it, right? I think hip hop tends to be higher on speechiness. And then the emotional valence. And so, yes, anytime you're taking 3.5 to 5 minute pieces of art and condensing them into 10 summary variables like this, you're losing a lot of that depth. However, what we lose in depth, we get to make up in scope of the data and comparative and comparability across different songs. And just to give you a sense, here's an example of a song. It's from 1989. I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. Maybe some of you might hum it to yourselves in front of your Zoom out there. Any guesses? Take a shot. Congratulations to those of you that guessed it was Madonna's "Like a Prayer." And again, can't really reverse engineer this, right? It's not like you can see that string of data and be like, oh yes, of course. But again, what it does is it allows to position songs. And so what we've done is to test this and see, like, are we actually capturing something meaningful? Are these songs being basically put together in a way that we can make sense of them when we try to put them together, when we put these variables together? And so one way to do that is to dimension reduce. And so this is using UMAP, which basically is taking the 10 dimensions that we had on the prior slide and trying to reduce it and have a layout on 2 dimensions. And I've just pulled a handful of genres. This is 20,000 songs, and it's scattered, right? You see the divide tends to be largely along the major versus minor key, mode. And what you see is rock songs in red tend to be along the top here, right? There's no real meaning to the north, south, east, west layout, but you see rock tends to be on the top. Hip hop also tends to be along the top, both in the major and minor key. You've got classical music along the bottom. And there's lots of things that are scattered throughout, right? This is not a nice, neat, clean breakup of genres, but music spills over into each other, right? And so we think that this is actually nice because it shows some tendency to cluster, but not so much that it's like over-engineered or over-fitting. And so again, this is just sort of a sniff test, and we've done this also looking at differences between male and female artists, and there's like no difference in terms of where songs by male artists or female artists show up on this layout. So it's not there's not something in the algorithm that's necessarily biasing things in one way or another. That's sort of the sniff test here. So that's our DV, and the way that we create it is to take a comparison set for a given song. So our interest is in each song that's put out, right? And so some things are going to be at the artist level, but each individual song is what we're looking to measure our variables at. And so constructing our measure of creativity at the song level, we take a given song, we define a comparison set, and we did a 10-year rolling window. So a song that comes out in January of 1990, we look at all the songs from 1980 through December 1989. So that 10-year rolling window. And the idea being that, as technology advances within music over decades, you want to basically create something that's going to allow for reasonable comparison of what sounds new and different, but doesn't necessarily either overestimate novelty or dramatically underestimate it by changing the window around too much. So we define our comparison set, and we've played around with different windows, and it doesn't really change a whole lot, fortunately. We then calculate the feature distance between every song pair in that comparison set using a cosine similarity measure, so 1 minus the cosine similarity. We then aggregate that across all the song pairs to create a song level novelty score for each individual song. And then we scale it to 1 to 100 so that it's got a nice distribution. For our regressions, we take the logarithm just to make it a little bit more interpretable, because we have some things that skew. It's a bit skewed, as you'll see in the next slide. And this is what the distribution of creativity amongst popular music from 1955 to 2000 looks like. And if you think about this being on a 0 to 100 scale, most music's not super novel, right? It's about 20. That's the median. And that might intuitively make sense, right? First of all, your comparison set's large, so there's going to be some regression to a mean. But also, most of the music that gets put out, there's only so much variance that you can have and still be palatable to a listener. And there are songs that go up into the 60s. Tends to be jazz songs, more free-form type things. But things tend to cluster sort of on the less novel side. And if you're curious what it looks like over time, here is what the average of song novelty from 1960 through 2000. We basically don't have 1955 through 1960 in the analyses because it's not enough comparison set, and so it skews things a little bit. And what you see is, maybe not surprisingly, if you know the history of music at all, the 1960s, generally a very creative period for music. And we think that this is nice because it confirms, or at least supports, what a lot of music critics and people who study music have said about the 1960s generally being considered an era of very creative music production. 1970s, you see that dip, sort of bottoming out in the early 80s, and then bouncing back up through the 90s as more hip hop becomes mainstream, country becomes more popular and diverse, and just the proliferation of genres really starts to fan out, and creativity comes back. So that's what it looks like overall. If you're wondering about some examples, on the upper end of novelty from rock or pop or hip hop, we've got Slick Rick, Lottie Dottie for hip hop fans. We've got Deja Vu by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, one of the first supergroups. And we've got Captain Beefheart, Alice in Blunderland, which, if any of you know Captain Beefheart, you'll know that that's pretty novel sounding music. Highly recommend you check it out. It's pretty out there. And then the lower end of novelty from sort of the mainstream genres, and I derive a lot of pleasure from demonstrating that Phil Collins, for example, is not particularly novel, nor Steve Miller. And then for you 80s kids, the theme song from Magnum PI, which is in our data set, happens to be one of the less novel songs. Just to give you a sense, maybe pass a sniff test if you have some familiarity with these particular songs. So that's our DV. What are our main independent variables of interest? Remember, we're looking at the structure, right? The access to diverse ideas, and the influence of creative collaborators. And so to create the exposure to diverse ideas variable, we again pull all of the prior collaborators for a focal artist at the time of a given song release. We then identify all the unique genres associated with those collaborators, and we compute the sum of distances based on co-occurrence between all pairwise combinations of genres in the data and for each song and each artist. And then we normalize that by dividing by the maximum sum of distances so that we get a 0 to 1 scale, which we then again multiply by 100 to make it comparable to our DV. For our other IV, the exposure to creative alters, and honestly, this is where I would love a little bit of input, is for any ideas around what you might call this phenomenon, if you've seen something that talks about this kind of phenomenon. I don't want to plant any seeds because we've had some ideas and discussions, but basically, like, are there phenomena from social psychology, from network science, from organizational behavior, from physics, about creative influence of others that you think might be an interesting way for us to approach this or to label it? That would be super helpful. So exposure to creative alters, right? We take the same set of collaborators for each focal artist for each song. We then identify all the prior songs that each collaborator released within a 10-year window. We take the average song novelty for that artist, right? The collaborator and band member. We've also looked at max novelty, but we take the average for what I'm doing here today. And then we take that average for all the collaborators into a single value for each focal actor's song. So each song, all the collaborators look at their history, how creative was their song output on average. To give you a sense of what these look like, first of all, note that the kind of modal experience or the modal release in our data is a group that had one release, right? In our brain, we think, well, the musicians are so many of them, they're so popular, they put out so much stuff. That's actually not generally the case. Most musicians come together as a band, they put out one album, like their family and a few friends listen, and then they move on to doing other things with their lives. So there's a lot of zeros in these variables. And so we've done some things with imputation, but just to give you a sense of what these look like, right? The histogram of the exposure to diverse ideas, right? Most people are not that connected beyond the genre that they're in. Their collaborators don't necessarily bring lots of new genre material for them to work with and come up with new creative ideas. Again, skewed. So there's some people that have lots of exposure to diverse ideas, but in general, most people, not too much, just a little bit. In terms of exposure to creative alters, the distribution is a little bit more normal, and that makes sense, right? The peak is right around the average, right? Most people are getting kind of when you sum across their collaborators, they're getting kind of an average influence of creativity that's coming into them from the people that they work with. And what a lot of network scholars would say is, well, you're sort of capturing the same thing from two different perspectives here. And that's kind of the fight that we think we're going to end up having to have, and that's okay. What's interesting to us is the correlation between these variables is 0.04. So they're not that connected. We're clearly, at least statistically and empirically, picking up two different things. Whether they're proxies for something similar, that's a longer discussion, and that we'll have to get into when we're writing the paper. But we think that we're actually picking up two different mechanisms of creative influence. So what does this all mean in terms of our data and our output? Our regression results. And so rather than show you kind of all of the control variables and everything like that, what I'm going to show you is just the standardized results from some different regressions where we put in the different variables to give you a sense of what is the influence of these different variables on creative output. And so that's where I'm headed with this. So start first with a baseline model. And there are some other controls that are not in here, but these are sort of the key variables that we want to focus on. And what you see is the different influence that each of these different factors have on song level creativity. And I want to draw your attention to a couple in particular. The first one is that female musicians tend to put out more novel songs than male musicians. And here's another plug for the paper that I'm working on with Michael, Sharon, and Brian. This is actually something that we're studying in more detail. Sort of what are the conditions around which this happens, right? Why is it that women put out more novel songs, and what are the implications for artists that remain in the industry in terms of their collaboration with women, and also the genres that they're part of or get sorted into. And I won't do a spoiler alert, but basically finding out that does actually influence male creativity quite greatly, as a function of the fact that women tend to be underrepresented and yet more creative. So that's nice that we have the same finding again here. Again, the baseline is groups, which are the least creative overall, the least novel. And then also want to draw your attention to past artist creativity. So we take the average level of creativity for each artist for all the songs that they put out previously. And you'll see that has the largest influence on current song creativity, which is good because, while we want to talk about structure and we want to talk about influence, we don't want to say that there's no agency in this and that there's no creative endowment. And so we think that this shows that, yes, there is absolutely individual levels and individual differences of creative output, and we're capturing that. But above and beyond that, what else can we say? A couple other things to look at. You see that artist tenure and it's basically how long the artist has been in the industry is a U-shaped curve. Brian and co-author of his, Ben Jones, do research that shows creativity tends to be U-shaped throughout scientists' career, right? Putting out creative things early on, impactful things early on, then dipping and then coming back. We again find that in the music industry. And we find that artists that have charted or that are on major labels tend to put out less novel songs. And that's a little bit of a replication of a finding that Michael and I have from a 2017 paper. So let's start looking at the IVs. And when we add, so you'll note that I removed a couple of variables here just for ease of visualization. And we add the number of collaborators that an artist has at the time of a given song, right? All their prior collaborators of the last 10 years. And what is their exposure to diverse ideas? You see that, unsurprisingly, it has a positive influence on creative output. Again, not the same degree of positive influence that female artists do by simple fact of being in the industry and being female, or the individual endowment of creativity, but it still has a positive and significant influence on creative output. And then when we switch and look at our other IV, look at the exposure to creative alters, we see that this actually has quite a large influence as well, and is quite positive, right? There's something going on about the influence of the people you collaborate with leading to as a focal artist, your creative output. And however, when we put everything together into one model, we see that actually the exposure to diverse ideas slightly outpaces the exposure to creative alters. And so there's something going on where both of these things have influence, and individually potentially some strong influence, but when we put them together, they're kind of reducing the effects of each other, despite the fact that they're not highly correlated. The variance inflation factor is not doing a whole lot. So it's not, we're not picking up something that with collinearity, something's going on that's actually saying that, okay, these two do work together to some extent, but maybe less than they do individually. Which piqued our interest. And so we ran an interaction model, just putting the two of them together. And this is where things started for us to get interesting, right? Because most people would assume that, wait a second, if exposure to diverse alters and diverse ideas is going to have a positive influence, and exposure to collaborators who are going to be influential to my creativity, if both of those are positive, then presumably that putting them together is going to have outsized effects, right? The interaction should be positive. And that's just not what we've found. And we've tested this in a bunch of different ways, and tends to be pretty robust, that there's this negative interaction effect, which we thought, okay, that's pretty unintuitive. That's pretty counterintuitive to what we would expect, and we should dig in there. And so we ran some additional models to try to look at what happens when we're taking different levels of these two different variables in the interaction model and seeing what happens. And I'll give you a second here to sort of absorb this. But what you see is along the x-axis is the creative alters going from low to high. That's basically the from 2 standard deviations below to 2 standard deviations above the mean. And what we've done in terms of the different lines are they are the 5th percentile, the median, which the 5th percentile is 2. The median is 4, and the 95th percentile is 16 in terms of the exposure to diverse ideas. And what you see is that when creative alters are not particularly creative, right? When your collaborators are not particularly creative, they're bringing you as a focal artist exposure to lots of different genres is actually really beneficial, right? On the far end of the graph here. But as you move right, and as those collaborators become more creative, what you're seeing is a diminishing return to the number of diverse ideas that you have access to. And so while it helps if you're narrowly focused on only getting influence from 1 or 2 genres, only getting ideas from 1 or 2 genres, the more creative your collaborators are within those genres, right? That allows you to be more creative. So there seems to be some sort of trade-off effect going on. And what we did is we actually then tried to look at curvilinear effects. And so that's what you see here. Again, with a similar, it's a 4-way interaction, which is a total mess, but plotting the margins. And what you see again is at the very, very low end, right? When your collaborators are not particularly creative, it actually appears not even to matter that much the kind of access that you have to creative ideas and diverse ideas. There's actually not a huge differentiation at all. And over time, or not over time, as you increase the creativity of your collaborators, right, as they bring you more inspiration or sort of more competition to be more creative, having access to diverse ideas is beneficial to a point and then becomes damaging to creative output. So there seems to be some sort of ceiling effect on the quantity of ideas, diverse ideas that an artist can have access to, right? There's an overwhelm point at which it seems like it becomes counterproductive instead of helpful for creativity. And so thinking about what are our findings up to this point, again, remember I said this is relatively new, moving in this direction. And we see some evidence of unique but similarly positive effects of both the exposure to diverse ideas, sort of the canonical network example of creative influence, but also of the influence of creative alters. And so who is right? Well, maybe everyone. We're trying to play nice, at least at this point. But there appears to be some kind of trade-off between the sources of creative influence, right? If an artist's collaborators are quite creative, exposure to many diverse ideas may actually harm the creativity of that artist's music. Right? It becomes difficult to do something with both the creative influence and all these ideas And our guess is it's some level of overwhelm or of just inability to work with all of that different material and come up with something creative and unique. Like I said, there's some evidence of a ceiling effect for the access to diverse ideas. And the bottom line at this stage of the game is that too many ideas appear to be difficult to work with, which we think resonates certainly beyond music when it comes to creative output, right? Science, art, music, movies, whatever it is, that sounds like something that would make sense and is not necessarily something that we've come at before and been able to pinpoint empirically. So that's what we're trying to do. What's next? Well, the question that I posed to you, what's a good name? What's a good phenomenon from some literature that you're familiar with? Again, we have some ideas and some leads, but we're very open for exposure to creative alters variable. We want to start to explore our effects, and we've started to do this a little bit within artists and see how that changes over time. All of the models that you saw here were between artists, because we think that that's where the interesting traction comes from, right? As artists are putting themselves in different circles, right? Or as they are slotted into different circles as they enter the industry, what does that mean for their ability to be more or less creative? But we're going to look at what goes on within artists. We also really want to figure out sort of for whom or for which subsets of artists are these effects going to be the strongest or the weakest, non-existent, right? If you've been in the industry for a particularly long time, do you learn how to better handle all of these different creative inputs? And maybe that enables people that have been in the industry for 20 years to really take advantage of both diverse ideas and creative collaborators. We've started to poke around at that and think that's really an interesting way to proceed. And then, of course, we'll face the wrath of network scholars during the review process, but we've got a little bit of time before we have to do that. So that's where we're headed. Happy to answer questions, would love some thoughts and feedback. I was told to go until 7:45, and usually, like I said, I go long. And so today I've given a few extra minutes. So happy to open it up for discussion, Q&A, et cetera. And again, if you have thoughts and would prefer to email, then have your question read aloud, by all means, feel free.
Thank you so much, Noah. I believe Brian is hopping back on to help with questions. That was a very, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Noah, thank you, Noah. So Noah, we've got a lot of questions. Let me try to put them in order, because I think some of the early questions can help inform later questions, so you won't have to repeat yourself. So one very straightforward question is, how were you able to collect data on prior collaborations? How is that defined, and how did you collect it? What constituted that?
Sure. So that is coming from Music Brains. And basically what's nice about this online music encyclopedia is for every release, it has the credits on it. And so we're able to see things like who's in the band, certainly. And then we also, of course, have links. If those band members were either solo artists or in other bands, we have all that information. We also have access to producers, songwriters, sound engineers. And it's not necessarily, it's certainly not like exhaustive. I'm sure that there's some spottiness to especially once you get to like sound engineers and things like that. However, we do have pretty good data from Music Brains, which is publicly available. You're free to go check it out, and you can even download the data directly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, here's another question. If female artists experience greater requirements for surviving in a system, so could they be more selected upon than the male artists? Following up, the person says, we found something similar with academics in the discipline of ecology.
Yeah, yes, and this is the paper with Brian, and this is something that we're actually, so it's the challenge that we have in music is we don't have access to data at the selection stage. Right, so we don't know the A&R, the artist and repertoire, who's out there searching for new musicians. We don't know whether they're seeing a particular band and saying, or a female artist and saying no versus yes for a male artist. But what we're able to sort of back into a little bit analytically to suggest, and it's strongly suggestive of selection. But I would be, if you have more evidence, we have a couple papers that motivate that sort of being selected on. But I would love to see that for sure.
Okay, great. Okay, here's another question. This gets a little more into the specifics of certain artists and certain labels. Question is, you mentioned constraints around Motown as seemingly limiting creativity. However, one of my favorite writers wrote, quote, "There is nothing better than a few constraints you can kick against. In my own photographic hobby, I like using non-zoom lenses because it reduces the variable space and simplifies thinking and allows the other creative variables to be more focused upon." Thus my question are constraints always limiting to creativity in your findings?
No, and if that was the message that came through, that was a misstatement on my part. What I meant to say that Motown provides boundaries within which artists can be creative and cannot. However, that's not necessarily a function of the diverse ideas that they have access to. And so those constraints basically allow, like you say, right, to kick against something, to kick against those constraints and be more creative. And so the finding, it's not, I don't have the data to be able to say like, oh, they're constrained necessarily. Although we do find things like major record labels tend to put out music that's less creative, but that's about the extent, and independent labels put out slightly more creative music. That's kind of the extent of the constraints, but I'm totally with you in the belief that constraints actually enable creativity. But again, some of that's separate from or beyond this idea of the structure. So that was what I was trying to get at, apparently not particularly well there.
Okay, great. A question related to that one and the selection effect one. To what extent do you think that levels of creativity depend on what the audience wants to hear? So like if you look at the history of music, this question kind of touched on something I was thinking about. Jazz has an unbelievable explosion of creativity in the Miles Davis era. It's huge. Like he brings in new types of instruments. He converts stand-up bass to electric bass, even within individual songs. And Megan could tell you more about this than me because she's actually a trained musician and a jazz vocalist. He wanted to stay away from what he called the butter notes, the typical notes that you use that people are really familiar with. And the other notes can sound quite dissonant, but he forced people to bring that in. Now that was very creative. And it kind of had a good but very short run. And then after that, the audience seemed to move away from that, even though other artists were trying to emulate it. And I think that probably happens in a lot of music. Certainly Motown was trying to create a sound and a brand for African Americans at a time when they really didn't have it. And when their, great musical creations were really being adopted by and converted to other musical forms. And so how do you think about the audience playing a role in the creativity of the artists themselves?
So that's a really good question. And I'm not sure that I'm going to have a satisfactory answer. I think to some extent, so Michael and I have the paper where we look at the Billboard charts and use the similar data and basically show that songs that are optimally differentiated do the best on the charts. And so there's something that audiences latch on to, that it's kind of you could argue it's an optimal degree of novelty. And so now that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but it suggests that like audiences are drawn to something that's beyond, or something that is a little bit to the right of sort of mean novelty. And so the suggestion would be that actually, if that's a target, right? If artists are trying to hit that target, then putting out something with some degree of novelty, again, not too much, but some degree of novelty, is going to be not only going to show up as novel in our music, but is also going to lead towards more commercial success. And so if those two things are aligned, which isn't necessarily the case, but if those two things are aligned, then we're capturing something that's going to pick up both creativity and sort of audience demand for that creativity. I don't know that I have a better sort of answer for that. My co-authors might, but I won't put them on the spot here. But I think that there absolutely is going to be some demand for that. And I think part of the way that we control for genres that artists are in is going to pick up a lot of that, right? So pop music probably is chasing audience demand more than other genres, for example. So that's probably where if we can pick up some of that, but certainly not all of it.
Okay, a related question is, what's your take on purists? Because purists don't necessarily want creativity at all.
Purists in terms of like, I'm just going to perform the standards as best as possible.
Well, it could be, I'm not really sure, but it could be something along the lines of, you know, some people find it an abomination to mix genres because in doing so, it corrupts the purity of a genre in and of itself.
Yep.
So how do you guys think about that in your work?
So, you know, we don't, other than the fact that by trying to at least suggest that creativity can come from a source other than exposure to diverse ideas means we're open to the fact that just collaborating with other creative people is going to do something meaningful for song and artist creativity. However, our dependent variable, sort of what we're talking about, presumably is going to also kind of fly in the face of that, right? If you're a purist, you just are performing within your genre. Like you, again, maybe it comes back to that first question about constraints, right? Within a particular genre, there are certain boundaries, especially if you're a purist, within which you have to operate. And so perhaps those purists may be great at pushing the frontiers of those boundaries within a given genre. We haven't pulled specific sort of anecdotal or qualitative examples to add color to this, but that's something we're totally going to do. And that's actually a really interesting way to think about this beyond just the boundary spanners and people that are pulling from, you know, jazz and rock and blues and maybe even a little folk, right? Who are the people within a given genre that are going to be really creative, despite really sitting kind of at the heart of that? That's a really good point.
Got it. Still got questions coming in. Hopefully we could get to them all. Here is a question from a scientist who's also a musician. He's a keyboardist, does a lot of work, independent scholar. We love him here at NICO. Here's his question. Have you thought of testing your quantification of creativity by polling musicians? In my experience, music creativity comes in at least two flavors: recombination of existing perspectives and two, pushing of new concepts. Your definition may capture the first, which can be tested in polls. This could explain your surprising results regarding diverse exposure and creative alters, since the second type might increase as the first decreases.
Yeah, that's totally a viable mechanism or explanation for what's going on. We have not yet polled musicians. As you saw, you know, we've pulled some examples that we think passes a little bit of a sniff test, but again, that's his fans. Michael has a PhD in musicology. I'm not sure that qualifies him to say that this particular song is novel or not, be above and beyond what our data and our intuition says. But no, that's something that we've talked about doing because it would be nice to basically suggest that our algorithm is, and what we're creating in terms of our novelty measure is picking up something meaningful to musicians and beyond just our sort of interpretation and spot checking of it. Right. But that's certainly on the list of things we would like to do with this.
I suppose you could do it with what experts and analysts and reviewers have written about music as well. That might be another way to do it.
Yeah.
All right. Last two questions. I think we've got time for it. Okay. Sure. This one said, hey, nice work. Got a couple of questions though. Obviously you're learning to be a good reviewer. You didn't really talk about how good these regression results are with some standard measures, R squared. Without this, the interpretation, the coefficients are not really being very meaningful. Question number one, Question number 2, your dependent variable seems to be constructed in a similar way as your independent variable, specifically the variables related to creativity. Maybe you could use some users' ratings as dependent variables.
So the R squared on a lot of these models is in the sort of 0.25 to 0.4 range. And so from our perspective, that seems to, we're capturing something sufficiently, right? It's not like 0.01. So we think it's actually capturing something meaningful and picking up, the differences that we're finding in the coefficients are saying something. As far as the construction of the variable. So we and this is related to the last question about polling people and getting sort of interpretations and getting assessments. And I think it's something that we absolutely should do with this data. One of the reasons and one of the contributions, for lack of a better word, that we think that we're making is by removing the kind of biases that are pretty standard in any type of, and a lot of creativity research, right? Anytime you look at a lot of creativity research, especially in OB and in social psychology, it's all about judges' ratings. And that's meaningful and that tells you something, but then you've got the bias that comes in, and there's heterogeneity in that bias. And so it's open to influence. Now, are the algorithms that extract the features that we have, are they prone to bias? Absolutely. The one nice thing is that that bias is going to be universal across all of these songs. And so we're trying to remove some of that reviewer heterogeneity, that bias that creeps into creative studies, which doesn't mean that we can't go out and sniff test these things and check and make sure that we're capturing something meaningful. But part of the reason why we're using this data in particular is to not really focus too much on judgment and evaluation from that perspective.
Okay, awesome. So I got 2 more questions left, which means you got like 90 seconds to 2 minutes for each one. So
some constraints.
Yeah, here's a question. What would be your recommendations for taking your research and applying it to success in science?
Yeah, so what it seems to be is that there's some sort of trade-off between what's going on in terms of like the people you collaborate with and then the fields that you're going to expose yourself to. And so you kind of want to pick one or pick sort of a middle ground in between them. So, if you're thinking about doing research at the intersection of multiple fields, as many of you do and NICO do, right? You want to kind of limit that. The more you pull in, and this is at the individual level, not necessarily at the center level. At the individual level, you want to think about, okay, I want to work with some people who've put out creative and successful work, and I want them to come from, to come from or to have access to a couple of different fields. And this, jives pretty nicely with Brian's work, talking about levels of familiarity and levels of novelty in science, right? That you need some balance, and it's going to be skewed a little bit towards familiarity and what's already kind of known and is not particularly novel. And so finding that balance of some creative others, but not crazy creative, especially if you're trying to publish, it's very difficult to get like the moonshots published because people don't know how to assess or review them. And then also when you're working at the intersection of multiple fields, you can't have too many because again, people struggle to assess and understand them. So it's finding that balance and that trade-off between the creativity of the people you're working with, right? If you're just going to stick to sociology, you can work with the most creative sociologists because if you're right, and maybe this is kind of answering my purist question a little bit, right? Because they'll allow you to push the boundaries within sociology. But as soon as you start adding a bunch of different fields, now it starts to become a little bit more jumbled.
All right, very good. Seems like we've come to the end here. Let me just mention the last question for something you to think about. Maybe you could write the person in response. They basically are pretty interested in this whole idea of collaboration, but acknowledge the fact that collaboration isn't unidimensional. So composing a song may be different than playing on the song, may be different from arranging the song. And therefore collaboration may be too crude a measure to really pick up on what exactly is flowing through that collaboration.
That's true.
So,
and sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, take it. If you go one more minute, go ahead.
Okay, just quickly. Yeah. So at this point, we've basically, all collaborators are created equal. However, for them to factor into our data, they have to have other songs that they've worked on. So that tends to mean that collaborators are artists themselves. Now, that doesn't necessarily distinguish between songwriter, between a guitar player, but
Right.
it means that there's some history of artistry that goes beyond just being a producer, just being a sound engineer, something like that. Because those collaborators will rarely have sort of a history in our data set, and therefore won't show up as contributing meaningfully to the variables we have. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
something that we need to look into. We think we're sort of capturing it a little bit, or sort of we're saved a little bit by the nature of our data. But that's a good question.
All right, fabulous. There's one other question. I don't think we have time to think about it, but I think it's a good question. So let me mention what's going through someone's head, which is creativity can still use leadership. And leaders can help others put things together in a better way by solving disputes, translating information for one another in different styles in ways that helps people understand and appreciate things that they otherwise wouldn't. So that's also kind of cool. Anyhow, Noah, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody online. Thank you for all the questions. I do apologize if I wasn't able to get to all of them. Very stimulating, Noah, and a lot of stuff to think about. And gee, I'm going to go home and listen to music differently now.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thanks, Brian.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone. Really appreciate it.
See you
Bye.
next week.